Good evening, good night, and good morning to everyone. This is update for May 11, 2022, day 77 of the war, end of the date update. First of all, I apologize for the quality of the audio, the low volume last time. So hopefully this works better today. I made some adjustments in the recording software, so hopefully that solves the problem. Okay, so let's go to actually our business. So, as always, we're going to discuss some strategic or sort of almost strategic questions, and then we're going to do walks through the front line. As a heads up, in terms of front line, it's really turning into World War One, where it's the front line is essentially static and it's a total mid grinder where you don't see many changes, but at the same time, a lot of people die. So let's actually start with one of the strategic questions: is what Russia is doing with sort of newly captured territories, and specifically Kherson region, which is here, and then part of the Zaporizhya region, which is here, because this area they already declared it's theirs. This Luhansk region, and then the Donetsk region, even though they haven't captured most of it, but still, that's kind of in their view is done business, and it's very clear what they're gonna do. It's gonna become part of Russia. Here with these two regions, first of all, there are a lot fewer ethnic Russians, and there's a lot fewer support for Russia in these two regions, and especially in Kherson region, which is much more ethnically Ukrainian region in its nature. So let's look at actually what they do, how they try to integrate them into Russia, because both regions are extremely important for Russia in general, strategically, for for the following reasons. First, this creates a land bridge to Crimea, which Russia did not have before, and that was a huge problem for them from all angles, logistically and economy wise and everything, and military wise. So now this creates a bridge, which makes them super extremely happy. And then second, this allows them to supply fresh water to Crimea, which we mentioned many times is extremely important to make Crimea viable as region for Russia and not create like huge black hole in terms of consuming financial resources from the Russian budget. So because you can create desalination plants, but they consume a lot of energy, and so therefore the water is super expensive. So, and here you're getting essentially free fresh water, so that makes things so much different. So what they do, the first thing is they switch trade to Russian currency, which is ruble. Then they said that now they introducing Russian laws that they're gonna work in these two regions, and it's been done slowly. Over they said over by the end of the year, it's gonna fully switch to the Russian laws. Then they change even registration plates for the cars. So you see this sticker here, which says TVR. It stands for Tavria. So this whole region will be kind of connected to Crimea. So it will become kind of like one Crimea, and this two other regions will become kind of like one single area, and it's called Tavria. So that's why they created this sticker, this TVR, which stands for Tavria. So then the more important things that they do, they actually switch education to Russian language. So and then even more important is that they changing the subjects that are being taught to children to, like, let's say Russian history, and then there are other subjects where there is kind of like indoctrination, basically, so that children will feel themselves as Russians as opposed to Ukrainians. So that's the most important part that's being done in these regions as we speak, right? So, so the idea is to eventually convert over time, over let's say generation. This will be totally Russian area where that this area will view itself as totally Russian and not nothing to do with Ukraine basically. So that's what they started doing right now in these regions. So that was one topic. Then another topic that we promised to discuss was artillery and why, and that artillery is extremely important in this war and essentially is probably key to success in this war. And so we brought you this chart that actually shows you um, regular artillery. So at the bottom, this self-propelled howitzer M109, and this is using M109 as example. It doesn't just we just use it as further reference, just for illustrative purposes, right? So this is your regular artillery at the bottom, right? And this is distances at which they fire: 10 kilometer, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, right? So, and then you see dispersion of the shells, right? At 15 kilometers, it's 95 meters. So really, if you're targeting something, your shell can fall up to 100 meters away from your target, which means that probability of hitting the target at first time is close to zero, right? Then dispersion becomes bigger. At 20 kilometers, it becomes like 120 meters, then 139 at 25, and then 260. At this point, you probably just totally wasting your resources by shelling. So what this really tells us in a short, and we don't have unfortunately numbers for 10 kilometers and then 5 kilometers, but obviously dispersion becomes lower for those distances. So the whole point here is to say the following: that essentially for the distances above 10 kilometers, artillery fire is almost useless unless you have 100 pieces of artillery per 1 kilometer of the front line, or 200 or 300 or 400, which is how the World War II was fought on the Eastern Front, specifically by the Soviet army. They would accumulate 200, 300, 400 units of artillery per 1 kilometer of the front line, and they basically obliterate everything, right? You don't rely on precision because your dispersion is so bad, so you rely on the quantity, right? So basically it's a typical dilemma: quality versus quantity, right? And in this case they solved it by increasing quantity of the number of the shells that are being shot at the same area. So eventually one of them will hit the target, right? So that's how the sort of call it standard, your average typical artillery works. And this is for M109 self-propelled howitzer. All Soviet made have worse dispersion than this. So this thing is becoming even worse, right? Because typical sort of feature of the Soviet engineering is to cut corners pretty much everywhere you can. So that reduces quality of the product tremendously. And so if you compare it to M109, then it gets, it's going to be even worse. So you're relying even more heavily on the quantity versus quality, right? So that's the situation with artillery, right? Just so you conceptually how it works, right? And this is true for Ukraine and for Russia because they use the same equipment, the same approaches. There is no difference. There is important sort of advances that we need to keep in mind. One is called this PGK, and what really this means is very simple: that your shell has kind of like a fins or little wings that help to guide the shell more precisely. And basically, there's a GPS device that gives information to those fins, and they guide the shell. And so dispersion becomes much smaller, 50 meters, and regardless of the distance, right? So, and actually, the newer one, what we saw, like some of them are made by the Turkish manufacturers, is about 20, 25 meters. So this becomes much more precise, right? Still not perfect, but very precise, right? And then there is sort of top-notch approach, which is making your shell almost like a little rocket. So again, you have GPS there, and then you have little rocket that flies, and the dispersion there 10 meters, right? So it almost perfectly hits the target. The only problem here that's important to keep in mind that this little rocket costs also little fortune, like little rocket, 70,000 US dollars. So one shell, I mean, it's tremendously expensive, right? Then this fin guided shells, they cost 5,000, and as we discussed with the introduction of the Turkish manufacturers, probably will drop to like 2-3,000 US dollars per shell, which is still very expensive. And then regular cost is about 100 to 200 US dollars per shell. And for, let's say, Russian army, and used to be for Ukrainian, the actual cost is zero, because they use inventory from the Soviet time, where there's enough inventory to conquer the entire world, probably a couple times. So that really means that the cost is close to zero. So that incentivizes Russian artillery to heavily rely on quantity versus quality, right? So for that reason, they had equivalents of this fin guided and little rockets as sort of like a test uh, uh, sort of examples, but they don't manufacture them, because there's no need. Like you just have too many of the regular shells, you just obliterate, right? So they don't have good response to these two options. So like now Ukraine is getting, it's probably not getting these little rockets, but it's getting fin guided ones. And so that creates pretty difficult situation for the Russian artillery, because it can be easily now targeted in counter artillery fire, and it can be relatively easily destroyed with M777 howitzers. And when Ukraine gets M109s, AS90, and PH2000, that will become even worse situation, because self-propelled is always much better than stationary cannon, right? Which is M777 is a stationary cannon. So this is kind of like a big picture. Maybe it's too much information. We don't know, but we just want to kind of share that. So now let's go back to this sort of traditional, old school artillery fighting, right? So go back to the bottom one. So what they rely upon is, okay, so they shoot. Let's say they try to shoot, not to shoot for distances more than 10 kilometers, right? And probably even more so, more like they try to be around 5 kilometer, 7 kilometer range, because then precision is, you can hit relatively precisely the target. But so, okay, you shoot 5-7 kilometers, you still don't know, there's still dispersion. Maybe it's like 50 meters, 40 meters, there's still dispersion. So you don't know, did you hit it or not, or you did not. So here, that's why it's what comes very handy is UAV for this type of kind of approach. So for that reason, you can see Russia developed this Orlan 10, and we mentioned about this about a week ago. Developed it in 2010, and actually not developed, actually introduced into the armed forces. So it was probably developed, 2008, 2009, somewhere in that ballpark. So, and they produce quite a bit of them, 200 to 300 per year. So they have probably more than 3,000 units, or at least they had before the war started, right? Because they're losing them, and now they actually cannot manufacture them because they have components that were sanctions from like Japan, from Germany, and so on. So they cannot really manufacture them, but they have huge stock of it. And so what is important by this UAV, as it flies over battlefield, your artillery is shooting, and it allows you to correct your fire. So maybe first time you didn't hit the target, you still may not hit the second time, but the third time you almost like guaranteed to hit the target. So right, so like 1, 2, 3, and the target is destroyed. So this makes this like old school artillery that's usually super inefficient, as we can see from the dispersion, relatively efficient at the small distances. Like, and by small distances, we say less than 10 kilometers, and probably sort of less than 7 kilometers, probably better range for that, right? So now what this UAV does, it enhances effectiveness of Russian artillery tremendously. And given that they can use unlimited quantity of shells, that makes them very, very deadly. And that's what Ukrainian army is experiencing firsthand, as losses due to artillery fire are very, very, very high. And so that's, you know, probably majority of the deaths are attributed to artillery fire at this point. So, and let's just kind of quickly go through the, you know, characteristics of this technical spec of this. The most important is that engine is they use gasoline engine, so it's very easy, cheap. That's dirty cheap engine. Where the cost is coming from is they have optical camera, and then they have infrared camera, right? So those are all uh, I believe from Japan, and I think some of them is from the US, FLIR made. So that what makes this thing expensive. The whole the plane itself is dirty cheap, right? So, and then what they get with this gasoline engine is very long flight duration, up to 16 hours, right? So this is really excellent, because you shoot it and it just flies pretty much most of the day. And then really long distances, right? 120 kilometers, and then 600 in unguided version. So what this means is you're not receiving a signal, right? So they don't have a strong um, antenna on this. So the only you can catch signal only up to 120 kilometers. Sorry. So as you can see, this device is, even though it looks kind of very primitive, but it does its job very well, and it's a good tool for the job. And what makes Russian artillery so good is that these UAVs are embedded with every artillery battery. So it's not like commander from other unit can take it from them. It's theirs, right? It's like nobody can take it from them, from this artillery battery. So it's just dedicated to servicing this specific battery. Nobody else can take it. This is just theirs. So that creates huge advantage, because they can always rely on it. It's always available for them. So they basically use it all the time, right? So that's organizational advantage of the Russian artillery that they have over Ukrainian artillery. We're not discussing other countries because we don't know enough to discuss about other countries. And then let's now look at the Ukrainian side of the equation. So Ukraine has what's called Leleka 100. This was developed in 2017, but it was accepted by Ukrainian army only in May 2021. So you can see how everything is much worse, much inept, sort of more unprofessional, and all that stuff, like all the negative adjectives that we can use in this situation, right? And even so, we know from our own knowledge is that for that 2021, the military budget was not financed, because there were political fighting between them inside of the military, and then between the political top, and so they basically took away the money that were earmarked in the budget for military and used it for construction of the roads, basically. And so you Ukrainian army, essentially, it was kind of like accepted, but they maybe received 20-30 units before the war started, like, so there's not, like, basically nothing, right? And then now we're hearing that in April they were made 25 of them. So it's essentially drop in the bucket, totally insufficient. In addition, from what we're understanding, they are not embedded within artillery units. It's like standalone in a way, so they can always be taken by other like high ranking commanders for other purposes, for whatever the fire they have. They just move them, and so you don't have it. So that's a significant organizational disadvantage that makes them like a lot less useful for Ukrainian artillery. And then if we look at the technical specs, it's also worse than the Russian competitor. And the most important sort of weakness is that actually uses electrical engine, and that means is that the duration is very low, is only 2 hours, and the maximum distance is 100 kilometers. And we also would want to uh, point is that environment temperature here is minus 20 degrees Celsius versus here minus 30 degrees Celsius. And this is driven actually by that's why we kind of pointing that this electrical engine is not good choice just from our architectural point of view, is because the batteries lose power very quickly when the temperature goes below zero. So that's why you see here minus 20. And so what we also think is that if this is cold weather, like a winter time, we don't think that they're gonna get 2 hours and 100 kilometers. It's gonna be much shorter, right? So in a summary, what happens with this Ukrainian device UAV is that it's of lower quality in terms of its technical capabilities in the first place, right? Then it's organizationally incorrectly done. It's not embedded in the artillery unit, right? So there is a lot of and then the third one, the most important, there are very few of them, so that's totally not enough for Ukrainian artillery. So so essentially you have almost nothing on Ukrainian side, and then you have almost everything on the Russian side, right? So that's what makes Russian artillery, or was making up to now, very dangerous and much more efficient than Ukrainian one. And the only sort of saving grace for Ukraine was that there are a lot of like Ukrainian civilians who would just use commercial drones and help Ukrainian artillery, and that's what really saved this tremendous people support. Like regular people would go and would die because these commercial drones, they're not designed to fly. Even 10 kilometers for them, it's not possible. Most of them fly 1-2 kilometers and that's it. So you have to be very close to the target, and very frequently they would get killed by the Russian troops because they spot them and kill them. So there's a lot of this unknown heroes who died helping Ukrainian artillery, and that's what sort of to extend help Ukraine to destroy all of those large Russian columns of troops near Kiev, right? But there was tremendous human cost to that. You saw nice pictures, but there's ugly truths behind them, basically. And so that's what's been going on right now. Ukraine's basically still heavily relying on these commercial UAVs. They are totally not enough. Like they just totally not enough of the range, right? On 1 or 2 kilometers is extremely dangerous, basically, for you. So that's what's going on at the big picture. That what is changing a little bit with arrival of M777 is that they have this fin guided shells. Ukraine gets this fin guided shells. Ukraine does not get these little rockets. I mean, for obvious reasons, they're super expensive. But this fin guided already great tool. And then what Ukraine gets is also counter battery radars. There are several. There's like a family. I think it stands like PQ, and I don't remember exact abbreviation for it. I think it's A and Q or something like that. There's a family of them, like A and Q 36, and then there's like something in 40s and something in 50s. So I'm not very familiar with that, but basically they being used for to spot Russian artillery batteries and obviously destroy them. So now as Ukraine gets this fin guided um, shells, it will be much more effective fight against Russian artillery, because now you know from the radar you get GPS, almost very precise GPS coordinates of the Russian battery, and then this fin guided shells, they're quite precise, right? So you almost guarantee, so you don't relying as much on UAV. You kind of like almost you have good guess that you're gonna destroy Russian battery with these tools, right? So this kind of helps to mitigate the situation and somewhat shifts balance of power towards Ukrainian side, not tremendously, but right now the situation is not so negative for Ukraine. It's kind of becoming more balanced. Okay, so this was a long story about artillery. Hope this helps for everyone. And, you know, and sorry if some of the people don't want to listen to this, you can always skip this part. So now, once we're done with this, let's actually go and look what's going on at the front lines. As we mentioned, they are very static. It's World War One, and let's start with as always we do. We start in a clockwise fashion, and we start with north, with Kharkiv region. As we discussed, Russia created a buffer here, uh, like so. And what happens right now? Ukrainian side is slowly destroying this buffer. So what we heard tonight is that Ukrainian side attacked village of Ternova and managed to get to Ukrainian-Russian state border here in this area. So essentially, it's not really bridgehead, but let's say kind of like look at this as this bridgehead. It was cut into two pieces, right? So at this point, there's small bridgehead here, which probably at this point will be cleared out pretty easily, pretty quickly. And then, there is a bigger one here. For whatever reason, Russian side defends very strongly this area. We're not sure what's the reason for that. Maybe because it's closer to Belgorod, the regional capital of this area. But we're not sure what it is. But it's a question of time before this whole area will be cleared of the Russian troops. And just to explain what it is here, these are like third-rated screening troops here. This is not like large quantity of regular Russian troops that are there to defend at all costs. They kind of like defending it, and if they pushed, then they just retreat and they just leave like rear guards to kind of slow Ukrainian advance. That's kind of like what it is here. And then there was actually a question from the viewer in comments is, they hear like, we hear that Ukraine liberated today, like village, whatever, Ruski Tishki or Vesele or Lisne or Slatine, and yesterday there was another village. What happened is actually, this is how actually this whole thing works. So the Russian troops about a week ago, so like early May, they immediately withdrew to this area that we show you right now, right? So this is where they withdrew, right? So Ukrainian troops were a little behind here. And so there's large gray zone, no man's area. And so Ukrainian troops are not fast to follow the Russian troops as they retreat. They kind of slowly come into these villages. So and then Ukrainian propaganda uses this as to create the picture like every day we have a victory. So there is a change in the course of war. We just every day we destroying Russian troops and recapturing territories. When in fact these territories were in the first place not strongly defended by Russian troops and essentially abandoned and retreated. And essentially Ukrainian side is just coming into empty houses to great extent. Not always. Sometimes there are like small skirmishes here and there, but there's no true fighting how it's done elsewhere in Ukraine. So, and this is very similar situation to what we mentioned at the end of March. If you remember then, At that time, we're just going to go back here. If you remember, we spotted that Russian troops are withdrawing in masses from all of the northern and northeastern Ukraine. I think it was like around March 30th, plus minus. And then we confirmed that on March 31st, so that they all gone. But if you remember at that time, majority of media outlets still were talking about Russian troops still somewhere in northern or northeastern Ukraine, and there's intense fighting going on, and Ukrainian troops pursuing, like kind of like winning and kicking like Russian troops out. That was not the case. That was exactly the same story at large scale. What's going on right now in Kharkiv? Basically, Russian troops decided to withdraw at that time from all of this whole area, and they did it in very organized and quick fashion over roughly 36 hours. They were all gone from like huge territories. You can see the distances here from Kiev to Russian border is about 300 kilometers straight, right? And here to the northern border is about 100 kilometers. And there were like roughly 100,000 troops. So the withdrawal itself was not simple in terms of even from organizational side, but it was done pretty quick, and so they were gone. But then, for a week, then all of the media was reporting, "Oh, Ukraine captured this, village or this town or whatever." Well, they were all essentially abandoned by Russian troops at that time. So this is the same story here in Kharkiv, but at much smaller scale. So now let's actually continue. We discussed this, and then okay. So just to kind of finish this point, because it sounds like, oh, okay, Russian side was not defeated or anything. Yes, they were strategically defeated, right? So they were not defeated in terms of like straight battle, in terms of like Ukrainian army launched offensive and defeated. They were defeated strategically in terms of that they cannot push anymore, and they were suffering losses, and so they were becoming like slowly melting ice cube, right? And eventually it would just turn into nothing. So Russian command realized that, and they then decided to minimize the losses and withdrew those troops so they don't become zero, right? So that's how the victory was achieved, not in a sort of straight battle on the field, but actually by like kind of like disbursement of Russian troops and slow attrition of Russian troops, because they were, basically, as we discussed this, the death by thousand cuts. So that's what was happening to Russian troops around Kiev, and this is what's similar situation here, because again, Russian troops at this point in general are melting ice cube, right? So there are fewer and fewer of them, and so far Russia is approaching a point where they have to decide what to do: either start mobilization in Russia, or they're gonna be the situation with Kharkiv will be repeating at other locations eventually, very soon, because Ukraine also, first of all, Ukraine has quite a bit of sort of soldiers, people, right? So like they have a lot of reinforcements that are like sort of ready, but they don't have weapons, right? That's a problem of Ukraine. But they ready. So like if someone get killed in brigade XYZ, you immediately getting replacements, right? In the fresh troops. Versus Russian side does not get that, right? So they basically, that's it. Like you don't have much of the fresh replacements, very little, let's put this way. So for that, they kind of like slowly melting cube right now. And eventually it gets to the point that Russia has to do mobilization, or they will have to leave Ukraine. There's no kind of really other option, unless they use like some unconventional weapons like nuclear weapons or whatever, something sort of like a Wunderwaffe in talking in the World War II terms, right? So they that's the problem that they facing, and especially the timing for this accelerates with Ukraine getting weapons from the West, and by weapons we mean heavy weapons, so like something like this M777 howitzers. But there are also self-propelled howitzers are coming, right? So that will make it even worse because self-propelled is ways better than stationary M777. So the situation will change for Russian side for worse, and so they will need to counter this Ukrainian advantage with something, and the only two options are more troops or using nuclear weapons, right? So that's, and we hope that it will not get to the nuclear weapons, and so they will be going passive, mobilization. But so far, that's the situation. For that reason, we're gonna look again. There is no fighting here on Kherson bridgehead. It's pretty much everybody's digging in and building defensive positions, right? There is very little fighting on this western section of the Zaporizhya front, and the only really active fighting is at this point shrunk to this Donbass salient, and that's it. It's essentially everything else is dead, and even this northern pincer of the Donbass salient is kind of also stalemate there. I mean, people still die, but there's no really progress there. And the same goes true for the southern pincer. So really, in a way, we can almost want to say is the Donbass salient itself shrunk to only Severodonetsk salient, right? So this is kind of our like very sort of hypothesis or working scenario, that it gets to the point that Russian troops cannot even execute Donbass salient, so they're trying to do smaller encirclement, smaller salient around Severodonetsk. So, and eventually that this will come to an end, and then that's it. Then it's the ball will start rolling in other direction, right? And it's already been going there with this, Ukrainian troops getting to the state border in Kharkiv region. So that's the first sign of that. So let's actually then go and look what's going on towards south on Izyum bridgehead, which forms northern pincer of the potential encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Donbass salient. So again, situation here is exactly the same. There are Russian attacks, but there is no progress. So basically, it's a mid grinder, right, for both sides. And there's, as we said, there's nothing there. The same situation is actually on the Liman bridgehead. Russian troops already also looks like they exhausted their ability to attack. They're still trying to attack. We're hearing about attacks here on Liman, but largely it's sort of there's not much, like there's no movement really. So let's actually now look at this what we call Severodonetsk salient, which is smaller sort of version of the Donbass salient, the basically tip of the Donbass iceberg, if we want to call it that way. So here, so let's first look at this northern part where Russian side is trying to create northern pincer, and so what we see here is this situation. They had initial success near this village of Bilogorivka, and they actually captured it 2 days ago, I think. And then Ukrainian army destroyed this pontoon bridge, and that's actually excellent. Sort of those thin guided shells are excellent tool for this kind of job, right? To destroy pontoon bridge. So it's kind of like an excellent tool for brain surgery, right? Versus the regular artillery is more like a hammer for whatever to break something. So and we do think that's probably how this pontoon bridge was destroyed, is with the help of M777. So basically, it was destroyed first time, and the small Russian troops were cut off, the size about a company, about like 70 to 80 people. And then we heard yesterday that, okay, Ukrainian troops didn't quite clear this whole Bilogorivka, and so basically that those Russian troops are still there, and then Russian side is trying to build pontoon bridge second time. So then it was destroyed again today, and based on our information, then finally Ukrainian side managed to destroy this bridgehead and clear up all of those 70 Russian soldiers there. So this is what we're hearing. It's not 100% confirmed in terms of that the Russian troops lost this bridgehead, but it's essentially dead end for them because, as we explained, Ukraine has artillery that can shoot from 25 30 kilometers away and effectively destroy this bridge, this pontoon bridges. And if you don't have pontoon bridges, then this bridgehead is useless. So for this reason, for now, this whole northern sort of pincer is essentially dead. And so Russian side is now trying to push from the south. So they had initial success. They captured town of Popasna, but now it's also stable here as well. And then they also try another area, which is Toshkivka here, and then Orikhva. So basically, they're trying to get either on this to get to this junction or get to this junction here, right? And then what they also do, they subject this road. As you see, this road, it's a main supply road of Ukrainian troops in the whole salient, right? So this road is under constant artillery fire. So it to the point that it's essentially unusable. So what we understand is Ukrainian troops are using this smaller, like field roads to supply, which makes it much more difficult and so on, but it's still doable. So situation obviously difficult for Ukrainian side. There's no question about it. But in the long run, if this persists, the Russian side is essentially lost and will not be able to make even this small encirclement here, which they tried and they had initial successes and it looked so far very promising to them. But so far, in our opinion, the probability is tilting towards that Ukrainian side will be able to hold on to this whatever, call it Severodonetsk salient, right? So that's kind of situation here. And by the way, for those people who from Australia, so their bushmasters are being used here near Popasna. Just they were spotted there. We don't know any other details, but they are used here near Popasna. In addition, what we also learned is that 17th Tank Brigade is operating here, and that it was essentially tasked with clearing this Bilogorivka and this whole area. So that's it for this area, and then we're just gonna look a little bit more south, just to kind of give you a feeling of the front line here, which is essentially more or less stable since the beginning of the war here. So let's continue looking. We're not gonna look at this section of the front line because again, it's stable since the beginning of the war. And we're gonna just look here at the straight west of Donetsk, because not even because it's changing, because it's essentially stable as well, like with the exception of this little salient that was created several days ago, just because it's an area of fierce Russian attacks, fierce attempts to break through Ukrainian lines. And the areas are, as you can imagine, the salient, then Avdiivka, town of Avdiivka, then village of Marinka, and then we believe it's a village of Novomikhailivka. So those are like essentially four main areas where the whole fighting is happening here on this front line, on this section of the front. But situation is stable here, as we discussed. Now let's actually look, let's move further and let's look at Zaporizhya front line. And specifically, we're going to focus at eastern section of this front line, where the Russia was trying to create the southern pincer of the larger encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Donbass salient, which, as we said, is extremely low probability of happening at this time. So nothing new here. So since the arrival of 128th Brigade and Azovki Regiment, they effectively stopped advances of the Russian 2nd Division, and there's also units of the 19th. So they all intermingled the last time we saw. So it's not just 42nd, it's just basically kind of like a mess there, organizational mess. And the same is going on, is true on Ukrainian side. There's organizational mess here. So, but the situation, the point is this, the front line here is stable. So this is bigger look again at the whole front line. The Ukrainian key strongholds are Kamienske, Orikhiv, Gulyai-Pole, and then Velika Novosilka, right? And the point, the importance of Orikhiv and Kamienske, that they are protecting Zaporizhya, which is very large major industrial hub in Ukraine. That's probably rivaling Mariupol, and since the loss of Mariupol, that's one of the important areas in Ukraine for Ukrainian economy, for the future viability of Ukrainian economy. It's dead, but for now, but at least it's not destroyed. So now let's look at the situation here on Kherson bridgehead, and as we kind of mentioned before, it's everything here is stable. Both sides are digging in. Russian side is on strategic defensive, and all they want is to protect these bridges, and the most important, this channel, right, that supplies fresh water. Okay, that's it for today. Till tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.